Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Richard Berwick, and I'm here with my esteemed colleague and co-host, Dr. Camille Clare. We'll be hosting this Q&A session today on behalf of the Social Media Committee for Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Green Journal.
Thank you so much, and so happy to hear from our colleagues of talking about such important issues. I'm going to transition to the conversation with Dr. Dole, and hopefully I won't fangirl too much in this presentation, but I'm so impressed by the work that she's done, and we're going to be talking about her article, "The Future of Research on Racism and Reproductive Health, Respecting the Challenge." It was a beautifully written afterword in the special edition of Obstetrics and Gynecology this month. So for our audience members, please check it out in October 2023 issue. And so, Dr. Dole, we'll start off. We need to have no introduction among us, but for our audience who may not be familiar with yourself and your work, can you please introduce yourself and highlight your position and your background in this area?
Sure. So my name is Kemi Dole. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Division of Gynecologic Oncology at the University of Washington School of Medicine. I'm also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Health Systems and Population Health in the School of Public Health. Um, in other areas that I feel like I brought into the piece that we'll be talking today is that I'm the founding director of underrepresented and medicine faculty development for the School of Medicine at the University of Washington. And I also founded and run a coaching company that's specifically to improve the careers and the career trajectory and the wellness and the success of women of color faculty in academic medicine and public health across the country. So I have just a great deal of passion around the research itself and health equity research, and those of us who do it, especially attendant to reproductive and gynecologic health research, both the research and the researchers, and how we care for ourselves and make sure that we're well in doing the work. In terms of my own research, I focus on Black-white differences in endometrial cancer outcomes and specifically doing work to improve equity for Black women across the entire cancer care journey who are faced with a diagnosis of endometrial cancer. And I am the founding director of the GRACE Center, which is the Gynecologic Research and Cancer Equity Center at the School of Medicine at the University of Washington. So thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. I mean, I wish we could really jump into all of the things that you're doing and all of your expertise, but we're going to focus primarily on this article. But what I really liked about your framing in talking about scholarship in the area of racism as a scholarship is really focusing on the three areas: the science, researchers, and community aspect. So there's a science to it, as you alluded to, and just like I'm on a race-based medicine, elimination of race-based medicine kick right now. And when we think about race-conscious medicine, research, medical education, and clinical practice is important. So you made a really powerful statement in the article where you say that the use of research and interventions to reverse the effects of systemic racism in reproductive health is really an opportunity to honor those who we've neglected for too long. And I paraphrase, not word for word, but can you explain what you really meant by that and how it's important for us to understand the historical basis for the work in this area?
Yes, of course. I think when we understand systemic racism as the overarching system that operates throughout all levels of our society, then we have to then understand that everything that we do in medicine and academic medicine and our entire medical healthcare infrastructure, operated essentially unchecked in that system for over 100 years, and so or longer, really. And so, if we recognize that, then I think we have this amazing tool in academic medicine of research and of science so we can make new discoveries and improve the outcomes for all people. And so I can't think of a better tool that we could use to honor the fact that we've had this huge blind spot for a really long time in the way that we think about equity, disparities, outcomes, and whether or not we are preserving the effects of systemic racism within our medical care or whether we are taking an active stance to reverse them. So I think it's important to understand our history because, not to have a pun here, but it does help us respect the challenge. If we understand how long we have been in a certain default, I think it helps us better assess how much unworking we have to do. And I would say I think the way that shows up most maybe clearly and often is so that we don't duplicate prior areas. We don't find ourselves in a situation where we're recreating knowledge that already exists because we haven't taken time to read or we haven't taken time to assess, the things that we know from healthcare disparity theory. There are a lot of frameworks out there and a lot of scholarship that can help us understand where we're going to see inequities and where we're not. What are the circumstances where we're going to see them show up and where they are not? And if we can avail ourselves to that scholarship that's often on the borders of medicine, right? It's in medicine's medical sociology or sociology. Then we have the ability not to waste time, frankly, in recreating studies that show us exactly what we expect to see if we're studying two different populations, one of which has been systematically oppressed and the other which hasn't. And so I think it's a call for me both to honor those that we've neglected, but to also honor ourselves so that our efforts are for the highest quality research. So we're doing things that are moving the needle forward, not recreating the past simply out of ignorance of what's happened before and ignorance of the scholarship that already exists.
You made some really good points there and focusing on how important moving beyond that biomedical model and
Yes.
perspectives in research is critical. And we spoke earlier with Dr. Meadows regarding data and why is research specifically in racism, and we're focusing on is a scholarship, right? Why
Hmm.
does that extend beyond those traditional objective data points that you mentioned, recreating that discussion of disparities that have been well published? Many of our colleagues are sort of just restating the fact that disparities exist and how can we move beyond that, especially when we're focusing on research on racism in particular.
Sure. So I think even the phrase when we think about traditional objective data, I mean, these data points came with an assumption that racism isn't at play. So most of the way that we do research, most of the things we're looking at is this assumption that we can have this almost like petri dish level of an objective environment where racism doesn't exist. And so once we recognize that that's not the case, right? And that we cannot randomize people to have not experienced racism, I think it calls us to another level of assessment. It calls us to be more creative in how we are asking whether it's quantitative or qualitative questions when you know you have a fundamental confounder of racism that you cannot remove. So I think that we have to extend beyond traditional objective data points because they are largely based on an environment where you could somehow control away the racism. I think the other thing about the quote unquote traditional data points is that usually we're talking about something quantitative. So we're saying, well, was there a delay in care or not? Or even in my world, sometimes it's, well, even if there was a delay in care, did it actually result in a problem? And the problem is defined as, was the stage of diagnosis more advanced or not? Or did the mortality change or not? And the problem with that framing is that when we have this overemphasis on the number, on the stage, on the mortality, the overemphasis, we ignore experience. And so the consequence of thinking that way is saying that somebody who spent, for example, 18 months trying to get her abnormal bleeding diagnosed correctly, whether or not that resulted in a difference in her cancer stage, that's 18 months of an experience of not being listened to, of being dismissed, of being questioned. And if we have to understand that those experiences have very real consequences to how somebody then moves through the rest of their care. And so when we have that lens, then maybe we can understand denial of certain types of treatments that we think are obvious that people should do. Maybe then we understand why people are rationing their medications or going for alternative treatments. And then also we have to open up our minds to the idea that those kinds of continual experiences with the medical system that are very negative can also have biologic and physiologic consequences that are being re-triggered every time we re-enter the space. So I think, honestly, I think traditional data points are important, but they're just the first step. And it's so much more exciting to think beyond those. I think it helps us like actually expand our creativity in a way that I personally love. And I think a lot of people are eager to do, but we do have to then acknowledge that the be all end all can't be the one objective data point.
Absolutely. And I mean, as scientists, that's what we should supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be innovative in our thinking
Exactly.
outside of the box. And that's so spot on when you mentioned experience, which we've seen in obstetrics, right? We've seen a lot of focus on outcomes, but how we can apply that to the birth experience of our patients. I want to talk a little bit more again about respecting the science that you referred to in the article. No
Mhm.
no one study can fix racism, no one solution, no one set of data points. Why do you think there's so much pressure for those solutions that are that magic pill, that magic bullet? And why does that become a problem specifically for scholarship and research in racism in particular in reproductive health care?
I love this question. Okay, so I think this is so interesting because it's both an internal pressure and an external pressure. So I think those of us who do health equity research, who do research on racism, we have internal pressure for a magic bullet solution because we want less people to die. Like Dr. Meadows does not want any more Black women to die. So like the thing is we also have this pressure of like this needs to work. We want it to work. Like we want the magic bullet, we want to be done. We also experience the external pressure, which I think has a little bit different flavor. It's a little bit less, we want less people to die, and it's a little bit more, we want to be done with this. We're done with talking about racism. We want to be done with talking about equity. We don't want to keep having equity institutes. Frankly, right, we're critiquing a society that created these circumstances. This society is kind of over this conversation. They want you to produce a magic bullet solution. So the problem with this is that the internal pressure can lead us to overly critique our own work, honestly. And I think it sometimes leads us to undervalue important steps along the way that we need to take. I think the external pressure is too happy for solutions that look good but aren't actually long lasting. And that is a major problem because that creates the kind of wheel that Dr. Meadows referred to as we're repeating the same things, we're publishing the same things, we're not moving forward because we're not recognizing this is a journey that does not have a magic bullet solution, but it's a journey we should make sure we're on. I always say that. I'm like, don't expect to be at the end of the journey when you first start, but make sure you're on it and we're actually moving forward. So I think distinguishing that is important. And for the internal pressure is why I remind people, I think that really comes from respecting each step along the way and understanding, like you said, Dr. Meadows, if something didn't work, that's still data.
Mhm.
Go through a PDSA cycle, go through and evaluate, okay, what assumptions did we have that were wrong? Where did we miss an influence that we didn't consider? Like that is part of the scientific method. And I'm hopeful for a future where racism research gets to avail itself of that kind of patience and interest in the scientific method that we give everybody else. We give this to immunotherapy. We give this to new biologics all the time. We're totally understand that there might be a negative study, but that's because of the dosing or because of that. We need to have that same level of patience and interest in innovation in research on racism instead of the pressure of the magic bullet solution.
And to that end, as we think about resources, right, and how we're able to fund this type of work, knowing that that is not an immediate solution to be found, how are we able to convince our funders, agencies that are contributing to this work, that small studies are also important, rigorous studies are important, because they all help, as you mentioned, move that needle forward, contribute to sustainability. Can you speak a little bit about that even more?
Absolutely. So I feel like this comes on two levels. One is I do think we need to recognize that I think our default is to have an unfair bar for racism research because of the pressures that I said before. So I think it's important. And I mean, you say like our funding agencies, like let's all remember that this is also us. Like our like we're around the peer review section, like this is us doing this to us. So let's remind ourselves when we sit down in study section, let's remind ourselves when we sit down and we realize, oh, this is an equity oriented grant application. I am likely coming with a bias where I want a magic bullet solution. And let me back up from that and approach this like I would any incremental problem that I understand needs like individual steps along the way. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, and I would say this is very personal from like how I approach grant writing and how I teach people too is to educate and reframe the problem. Because we are moving with that bias of magic bullet, I think a lot of our grant applications need to reframe what the actual problem is, because because of the I would say, because of the discussion and the decades and decades of repetitive research on this is what the disparity is, we can have people who have a sense in their mind, like, I've already read all this. Everything's already been done. So we have a burden of explaining, which you probably know if that's your area. This is actually what has been done and this is what hasn't. And often what hasn't been done is kind of shocking. Like, we've never tried this. We've never thought about this. We've never talked to these people. So you reframe the problem as a problem of a lack of engagement scientifically. And then when you're able to do that, I think it's a little bit easier then to then make the argument that, listen, there's actually a lot that we have to do here. And if we don't get this first step right, if we're not actually clear on what the disparity is that we're describing, if we're not clear on the actual cause, instead of race, but it's X, but it's Y, then nothing else matters. And I think that's another important piece that we've also seen over and over. If we make a whole intervention, but we haven't involved the community, we're not using the right language, we're not thinking about sustainability, it doesn't matter because it's not going to work anyway. So those are kind of the three ways that I approach this while acknowledging this problem, because we see it in the funding lines, right? We see it in the amount of allocated money that our institutes focus on equity get. It's there. It's very real. I think we saw it in the NIH study about what topics get funded and what don't. But I think that imagining those three things can help move the needle on those funding success levels.
So obviously you alluded to some of this, but what do you think in terms of investment? How can we better invest in the study of racism in reproductive health to the points that you just made?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, unsurprisingly to anybody, I have strong opinions about this, but I feel so strongly that we need so much more investment in education of our OBGYN trainees, of people interested in OBGYN. We need sociology classes, we need medical sociology classes, we need exposure to Black feminist thought, we need interdisciplinary workshops, classes where clinical researchers have to pair with social scientists to ask questions. We need grants specifically for qualitative study. We need workshops to teach people how qualitative methods can inform their quantitative methods. A lot of these things exist in these teeny little pockets here or there, or there's the one workshop that maybe you can do. But we don't have a culture right now in OBGYN of training scientists. And that's across the board. And I know that there's interest now in this at the NIH. We're talking about what happens when you train an entire clinical workforce, but you don't really have mechanisms in place to train clinician scientists. I just want to make sure that that conversation includes training clinician scientists who are experts in racism and systemic racism and equity. We can have extra research years for those that are interested. I think we're one of the few specialties that doesn't have a norm where there's a path where you do an extra 2 years of research if you want to. Things like this are things that we can tackle structurally overall. And then within tackling that, we can think about what do we need to help people learn so that they're ready to tackle these questions with the right context involved. So those are just a few of my thoughts, but I mean, we could do so much. We could do so much.
That's helpful because some of those concepts you allude to in the paper. So for our
Yep.
audience members who haven't read the paper, please check out some of the more specifics that Dr. Dole mentions. But you also talked about trainees, students and trainees. And so mentorship has been shown to be so critical in developing individuals' careers, especially careers in research and becoming clinician scientists. Can you speak to how trainee students can really find those adequately trained mentors to guide them specifically in this area of research?
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that this is another uphill battle because there are just not enough of us. I think, we have to recognize there are not enough Black academic medicine professors to begin with, talk less of people who are going to be trained in equity and health disparities frameworks. So I understand that and I acknowledge it. I want to tell trainees to read and get started anyway. And I want people to understand that you might just have to get started. You might just have to read other people's papers, read the frameworks, and go, how would I apply this to my work? Let me at least get started. Let me write up a draft of a paper. Let me think about doing a review using this lens. And then you find people to help you along the way. If I may, with a personal story, I had a 2-year postdoc in cancer care quality and outcomes. I had one meeting ever with Dr. Chandra Ford. And in that meeting, I had come and I said, listen, I read all your papers. I think this has to do with endometrial cancer. This is like how I think it applies. I'm not sure how this concept applies at all, but this is what makes sense to hear with me here. So even though I only had one meeting, I had really clear questions that helped me with my direction. And it's not perfect, so I don't want to say that it is, but sometimes I think our students and trainees think I can't even get started until somebody who knows what they're doing tells me what to do. And I say, most of us, Dr. Clark, Dr. Meadows, y'all are all nodding your head. You know what I mean? Most of us, like, girl, we didn't have anybody to tell us what to do. We just said, you know what? This is what I think, right? And like, based on my reading, I think this is what we can try. And I want our trainees to realize that they have valuable perspectives, that the insights that they think about when they're on rounds, those are good ones. And that the work is actually reading other scholarship and thinking, okay, how does this pair with the insights that I've been having? What do I think is a coherent question here? And moving forward anyway. And then I think what happens is that one, people like me who are super busy can help you better if you've already gotten started. I think the other thing is that you start to find people to help you along the way as they hear you reflecting the perspectives that they jive with, that they understand. So I try to like emphasize that to trainees because sometimes it's easy to look at us and think we must have had a mentor to show us the way. But so often the people that you're looking up to just had the gall to just do it anyway and like be wrong maybe, but try something. The last thing I would say, and this is especially for the OBGYN trainees, is get in rooms with people who think like this. So you have to get out of just being at the ACOG meeting, just being at the SGO meeting. You know, there are other groups like IAPHS, like Academy Health, like APHA. There are other meetings where you can interact with people who are studying medicine, racism in medicine this way and thinking about that. And that can provide immense amount of inspiration and direction that ultimately can also lead to mentorship relationships.
100%. I really applaud what you're saying and thinking about mentorship outside of the field of obstetrics and gynecology
Yes.
is so spot on. I just went to a Corey meeting and was just on
Mm-hmm.
fire by just a different way of thinking about research. And so I think a lot of these concerns that you mentioned when we focus on publications that continue to document disparities, I tweet about this all the time about how we can really move beyond just that documentation without that equivalent amount of rigor, scientific rigor to being oriented on solutions. How can we move away from this, that documentation that disparities exist to a more solutions oriented approach when we're addressing structural racism?
All right. I
I know that's a whole
I mean,
other
I
webinar,
just
right?
reviewed a whole paper about this, and it honestly was to no avail. They accepted that paper anyway. I was like, well, I
It
tried,
might
but
be the one that I'm familiar with, but
okay,
yeah.
right. But so this is what I'll say. I think some of it is a little bit back to the internal versus external pressure. So I want to say a few things. First of all, I think that I just want to take this moment to acknowledge that this whole documenting disparities over and over is not limited to like health services research. And I think sometimes we like let the translational research and even like slide. But if you're documenting the same difference in tumor aggressiveness, you're documenting the same difference in blood pressure, the same, like that's the same thing. It's the same thing if we're documenting over and over again that certain people have worse physiology, worse molecular biology, worse, et cetera. So I just want to make sure, because I think sometimes health services research gets an unfair burden of this like repetition when it's happening a lot in the other realms, and that's a problem too, because we're not moving forward in those realms then either. We're not moving forward towards intervention or solutions.
Mhm.
The second thing I want to say, Dr. Clark, is that we also have to be careful because some of the disparities that have been documented over and over are not documented well. So as Dr. Meadows pointed out, we used to just say race is the risk factor, and now we understand, well, actually it's racism, which then leads us to say how. Like, what is the factor? How is it operating? So I don't want to dissuade people who are maybe doing foundational work where they're trying to redefine the description itself so it's actually solution oriented. That work still does matter, because when we have the right framing, then we can move towards solutions. If the documentation is these people are broken, well, then we do need to like redo that so that we have it documented about what is actually missing or what the actual problem is. The last thing I just want to say is that I do think we do this all the time. Like, I don't know how many surgeon volume and outcomes papers y'all read, but like at some point we're like, we got it. Like, you do more surgery, you got less complications. Like, we got it. So there's a part of it that's like, I think there's a cultural aspect of kind of like, you see something works and then like everybody's repeating it because it's going to get published. I think what you're calling on, and what I definitely do too, is what is the effect? What is the negative consequence to this? And I think when we're talking about racism research and equity and disparities, there's a grave consequence to this tendency that we have to reproduce the same papers, which is that we will create a situation where we think innovation is documentation. And so we will leave a group of people with the same poor outcomes for decades and decades while appearing as if we are doing anything about it. And that is really bad. And so because I think that's the call, because the public health critical race praxis, Dr. Chandra Ford, it says very clearly, your work must be equity oriented. It has to be moving towards action. Something I think is very simple on the peer review level is, does this paper give you information that is actionable? Like, even if it's a description, that's okay, but what are they writing about that is the next step? And what's the plan for that? We can't keep having discussion sections that start off with disparities are multifactorial. We have found, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? So you get to the whole end and there's nothing to do. So I use that as my own litmus test. If I'm describing something, is it helpful because it creates something actionable? If you're reviewing a paper, does that create something actionable? A next step to figure out, well, why are the surgery rates different? Why did Black women more likely to decline? What's the next step? And I think that when, as like editors, I think at the editorial level, we have a responsibility to say, what's the trend here? If it's a year into your editorial season, and this is the 15th paper that you've seen describing the same things, then I think we can write an editorial and say, hey, the Green Journal has noticed that y'all keep saying the same thing about this. We are soliciting papers about the next step. Like, we can be active as an editorial body to say, we're noticing, you might not notice, but we know that this is the 56th paper submitted on this year. So we're going to let all of you know that we're interested in the next paper. So those are ways that I think that we can both kind of add nuance to this question, but also push all of us to keep moving forward towards actionable steps.
Definitely a call to action to Dr. Carter and her colleagues.
Hey, Dr. Carter did a great job with this issue, though. Shout out to Dr. Carter.
But the other third leg that you mentioned, which is so critical for all of us, is respecting the community. And so, can you really speak about the role of our community members in research endeavors, including, creation and co-creation of these questions that we have, specifically focusing on racism? I loved how Dr. Meadows put it in birth. I forget how she put it. Birth. I wrote it down. Birth optimizer.
Oh, optimizer. Yeah, me too. I said, oh, I love that. I want a
t-shirt. I definitely wrote that.
Yes, you need some merch. Yes, birth optimizer.
Yes. Can you speak a little bit more to the
yes. So I think we have to approach this with so much humility. So, I am somebody who I approach community engagement. Like, of course I want to do it. It's super important. Like, I understand this is part and parcel of where I want to move forward. And I had to learn over and over and over again, what does it look like to engage a community well? What's quality look like? How are you listening to people? What does it mean to meet people halfway? So The reason why I say this is because I think the first thing we can do to respect the community is engage with the community because you want to. Don't engage with the community because somebody told you you had to check a box, because you're doing more harm than good. Because it's obvious when that is happening and it's not helping anybody else that's trying to create real relationships. Recognize that these things take time. If your community has been mistreated or ignored or neglected by your hospital system for 80 years, it's going to take more than 2 lunches for people to care about your research. And we have to recognize we have the privilege of being at the institution, but we also have to carry the baggage of the institution. And I think that I call everybody who wants to do community engaged work to actively take both of those charges on, as like, this is not your problem. It's also part of your problem. What's amazing about community is how willing they are to partner with us anyway. I'm always shocked. They'll have stories about their sister being mistreated, this happened, yet they will still come to a meeting to help me figure out, how can we ask this question better? How can we reach people better? So I think that part of it, like the reason why I thought it was part of respecting the challenge, is because I don't want to see community become another checkbox. And I want to honor the people who do community work, because it's hard and it's slow and it takes a long time to build trust. The second thing I'll say is that we can make it a lot easier for researchers to do this. The institutional reimbursement processes and payment policies are actively hostile to community members. I mean, the number of times we've had to explain why we're paying this person that thing, or et cetera, is ridiculous. It's easier for me to send $80,000 to Dr. Audra Meadows in a subcontract on a grant than it is for me to pay $25 to participants who show up for a focus group without having to take down all their information. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So I think that I really advocate that institutions, if they're serious about this, should create a different lane of reimbursement for community members. They're not like vendors. They don't have LLCs. It doesn't make any sense. And we can make it a lot easier for the researchers and the community members to be in active partnership together. I think it's also obvious that you should pay them, because we're getting paid to do this work. So they need to be paid as well. Those are my thoughts.
So you alluded to sort of resources and financial support to our community partners. Some of the discussions that came up in a meeting that I was recently had to do with our indirect costs and so forth. And what is the disparities with that? So you alluded a little bit to the question I had regarding resources, financial resources, to allow our community partners to build capacity. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about that, but you were spot on in your comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the bottom line is that, like, as academic medical centers, as researchers ourselves, as people trying to do this work, we just don't exist in a vacuum or silo. We just don't. If we're going to spend time training our junior faculty on how to do research, or we're going to give them career development workshops and things like that, then like maybe we should think about doing the same thing for community partners who've signed on to work with us. If you've got a set of community partners who want to work with you, are you doing professional development work for them? Are you giving them opportunities to gain new skills? I mean, they're partners in this work too. So I just think the entire framing of recognizing, if these are partners that we respect, what would we want to do to demonstrate that we care about their future just like we care about the future of our work? I think that is like this perspective that I want us all to take, which can open up a lot of creativity about how we can make it easier. The other thing I want to add that actually goes all the way back to your first question for me, Dr. Clark, where you said, like, what's the importance of history? What's the importance of history? If you want history, talk to community members. If you want to understand the local context that you're entering into, you're bright and bushy-tailed and you're so excited and you're going to fix this problem of whatever you've identified, right? Black women are not reporting their pelvic organ prolapse. Like, what's going on? Then if you want to understand the local history of that, you're going to have to talk to community, and that is going to enhance your work. And so I think that it all comes full circle, and it is a challenge. But if we respect it, then I think we end up, one, respecting our own efforts. So we end up not devaluing the small things that we do to make this work meaningful, connecting with communities, spending extra time, doing the short little projects that people don't care about, et cetera. I think we end up respecting the community because we understand the hurdles that they're going over to partner with us. And we end up respecting the science and funding things that are really important, not just the things that are like most splashy and exciting.
Wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate all that you've offered today and really sharing your work. And I just wanted to know, I think we have a little bit more time, and I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about your research on racism and how what else we can learn from you and our listeners.
Oh my gosh. I would just say that, and this is in my piece. I'm not sure if we said it explicitly here, but like we have to take care of ourselves on the way of doing this work. There is a toll of doing work, and I think everybody needs to do this work. Like, I don't think that only people from oppressed communities are responsible for researching and fixing these problems because we did not create them. But I think that there's a special burden when you are researching the oppression of a group that you belong to. And I think, one, I want our institutions, our leaders, our mentors to recognize that extra burden. I want us to recognize how important it is to take care of ourselves, to pace ourselves, to not give in to urgency. This has been going on for 400 years. Like, what? There's no rush, relax. Like, I want us to take care of ourselves and to treat each other with respect and center the self-care and the wellness that's needed to have longevity in this work. Because what we really want to do is be able to build bodies of work that change people's lives. And that takes time, and it takes for the person leading that effort to be well, so that you can have great ideas, right? So that you can be innovative, so that you can be wonderful to work with. So that's the only thing I would add.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Dole, for your time. We really want to thank you to your commitment, your passion, which is felt by all of us for advancing research on racism. We're certain that your work, your leadership in this area will inspire others to address these challenges in their communities. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Berwick, who will conclude and give some closing remarks. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both, Dr. Dole and Dr. Meadows, for joining us today for this wonderful Q&A, and to my excellent co-host, Dr. Claire. Always a pleasure to join with you. And thank you to the Green Journal and for supporting this venture, and for the special issue led by Ebony Carter, as well as you guys have mentioned, who led this great effort, and to all the authors who contributed to the special issue on racism and reproductive health, and emphasis on health equity. I think it was a wonderful Q&A today. I encourage everyone to spread this if you're watching this video and enjoyed it. Please share with others to educate others in your field. And please take a look at the special issue, October 2023, in the Green Journal. Thank you very much for your time.